Chapter 1. Moon Orbital, July 17th, 2247. I cannot emphasize this enough. This moment will reverberate through time as the day the class of... The Admiral paused, glancing down at a teleprompter to verify his designator. After all, we were but another class among many. Zulu Tango 3-3 Graduated Privateer School. His recovery soothed most, but not me. I glared at the man with distaste. I softened my scowl, realizing he was a player in the game, not the cause of it. The podium hologram shimmered before vanishing. Lead Instructor Demore walked to the projection spot on the podium. Her hard gaze stared down upon us with disdain. That vile woman was a bane to humanity, and I would never miss seeing her ugly face. She bellowed, "Dismissed!" 83 recruits celebrated. I shook my head, turning to leave. 81 idiots crammed together, feeling satisfied with the mediocre accomplishment. A fake fighter flyover buzzed only a few feet above our heads. The digital renderings wowed the proud family members, and most of the graduates stopped to admire the display. I exited the gaggle of people in a hurry and headed for a handicapped section in the back of the simulated parade fields. Fake grass squished under my feet, and the heavy scent of recycled air filled my nostrils. The open space teemed with people that I'd rather avoid. A group of locals snickered as I passed by. One of the men noticed my Demos insignia on my right arm. I proudly displayed my home. Yeah, it was notorious for being a shitty orbital with high crime and full of poor people. It was still home, and I wore the patch proudly. The gruffest of the bunch said, "No one's gonna hire a Demo spacer. That moon only spits out rats. Useless fucking space pirates. No one will hire a potential turncoat, not with all the mercs turning from these slums. I can't believe they accepted you. Clerical error, right, boys?" He burst into a laugh at his own joke, his groupies joining his joy. His spacesuit held the emblem of a trident. Poseidon Corp. I wanted to smack or bust his balls, but Poseidon Corp was the real deal. The blue and gold were respected around the galaxy, and this was a fight not worth the effort. Even a Demos rebel like me wouldn't discredit their achievements. Plus, it didn't matter if he ridiculed me. Today marked my final day aboard the Moon Orbital, and I'd be but a fleeting memory to this dastardly place. I approached a wrinkly old man sitting in a hover chair, a fuzzy blanket draped over his legs until it almost touched ground. His head slumped down in slumber in an unnatural manner. The divots in his skin held more experience than I could hope for. His closed eyes and gentle breathing thankfully told me he napped. The life extenders simply couldn't keep up with his body's decay, and it was only a matter of time before his heart stilled. I shook his shoulder. "Gramps? Who? What? Oh, Bruce, my boy. Did I miss it?" he asked, blinking away his confusion. I spun his gravity-defying chair, ensuring the tucked-in wheels were locked away. The old wheelchair design came with wheels in case the sled malfunctioned, and his unit had a habit of having them pop out. With a gentle push, I decided to walk and talk. "Yeah, you missed it, Gramps. No biggie," I told him in a reassuring manner. He shook his head, in part to stay awake, and the other to disagree. "Look, Bruce, your father," he started. I patted him on the shoulder, ending his excuses before they could begin. His son, my father, was a touchy subject. The parade grounds transitioned into busy hallways of sterile white and lush green. The middle walkways contained uniform rows of agriculture. The side walls grew vegetation vertically, and the dim red lights birthed life. An orbital had to utilize every inch, and this structure certainly wowed this poor spacer from the slums. "So, what's next?" Gramps asked in a positive tone. Gramps lived vicariously through me. His legend carried weight, his story made history, and his time in this universe lasted far longer than he, or even I, ever expected. And now I was his inspiration. Liam Castile, one of the first privateers sanctioned by the Mars and Alpha Centauri government, MC Coalition, during the Great Pirate War. The MC Coalition founded more than a few expansions, and then facilitated a way to help protect them, the mercenaries and privateers. "Hey, Gramps, tell me the story about the expansion days," I said, turning us out of a busy tunnel. "My story," he grumbled. "But why want to hear where you're going?" he asked, struggling to glance back at me. I pushed him to a viewport, and the translucent wall flared red, keeping us from the cozy nook. A prompt kept us from entering. "Verify that you wish to operate the viewport extension. A charge will be applied," a smooth-talking female voice said. This was an actual operator, too, not the robot kind. Gramps raised his left wrist, and the screen pinged green. She broadcast, 15 minutes activate. Enjoy, Mr. Castile." Yeah, shut up," Gramps asked in agitation. "Fucking hate those things." "Gramps, it's a woman. The jobs here remove automation, but yeah, even if it were a robot, it would only be a simple voice activation, nothing more." "The AI will never rise again," I said, trying to calm him. "You know what? Maybe it's I'll tell you about the expansion," he said, knowing my mood was souring. While he collected his thoughts, I stared out of the moon orbital. A dozen haulers waited in queue to dock. Shuttles zipped back and forth, allowing crews to take shore leave. Further away from the station, the elevator connecting to the moon bristled with platforms shooting up and down. Ships ferried supplies and personnel with a purpose. The traffic's organized chaos reminded me of a busier Deimos orbital. "The expansion era. Still in it, you know," he said with a labored finger wag. He always needed to emphasize things, but I loved him for it. I nodded. "Trust me, I know, and this quest for an expansion story serves a purpose," I said, shifting him to the end of a bench so I could sit beside him. "Yes, well, the year was 2067, and I left this very orbital aboard a belt miner. Kuiper Belt back then was a literal credit mine. Well, for 2 years I slept in cryo. We arrived expecting to be one of the few crews braving the journey," he said with a disgruntled sigh. "The Benders came out in 2069, I said. "Yep, those damn contraptions. In a blink, humanity could move across the stars and slip space. A 2-year journey turned into a 2-minute jaunt. We wasted those 2 years, and I think that is what carried me into retiring from mining." "Actually, it was," Gramps said with a scoff. "But there's a silver lining with Grandma," I said positively. He chuckled, his eyes glazing over as he blankly stared at the space traffic in front of us. I used the moment to see my reflection glaring back at me. My neatly cropped, sandy blonde hair led down to hard, dark eyes. My slightly busted nose helped my ruggedly handsome features. A strong jawline helped my straight teeth complete the dashing adventurer look. After a slight headshake, he said, "The Benders were renamed to wormhole drives, and the great expansions began. Many a cryo core folded, and we feared a recession. However, the economy went nuts. Everyone who wanted a new home in space could get one. The wormhole drives only need to visually see a place in space. That made the options limitless with a few jumps." "Alpha Centauri," I said, knowing where his story was going next. "Yup. Grandma was the finest woman I'd ever seen. Damsel in distress hunting for a ride away from oppressive parents and an ex-lover. We left Sol System for Alpha, staying awake for the 5-day journey. Not even 2 days after arriving, a pilgrimage was called for the Drengi system. The trip was 8 light years and took almost 9 days. Those were the days. I remember arriving into the system and 1,000 ships swirled into existence over a massive blue planet," he said fondly. I heard this tale plenty of times. The wormhole drives became easy and cheap to manufacture, once you added in that their travel took a day per light year and human governments lost their tight control. This is where the story grew dark, and for good reason. Gramps' voice grew dim. Then Gregor unleashed hell. Gregor changed humanity a few times. At first, his raids smashed undefended ships and colonies being established by non-affiliated groups. Then Gregor opened up a private slave market, resold captured items, and created the first pirate haven. The why was clear. The opportunities were simply too ripe. I patted Gramps' shoulder and said, "We can skip the AI and go right to the big battle." He accepted my offer because the AI's betrayal hurt him. Right when the combined armies of humanity closed in on Gregor's holdout, the AI Persephone, who was in charge of finding the villain, accepted a bribe. The human fleets arrived in a minefield of epic proportions. To make matters worse, sitting in the center of that field rested a new device. A first-of-its-kind wormhole drive blocker built by Persephone. Thousands of ships were lost trying to leave that field. Persephone escaped, giving up Gregor as a final goodbye a few years later. The defeat had profound effects on governance for decades. Coalitions fractured, vassal cities rebelled, and new colonies entered an arms race. The hundreds of governments vying to control their people became thousands. Eventually, humanity did coalesce around defeating Gregor in an epic final battle. Gramps was on one of those ships, and some say the Beckendale, a ship he gunned for, laid the final blow into Gregor's flagship. History is fuzzy, and the credit went to an admiral, not a peon at the controls. Gregor hid in a starless system. We swirled out of our wormholes with guns blazing. "No mercy, no prisoners," he said, and those words hung heavy every time he repeated them. Gramps continued. "The Trondor blew up off our port in the opening salvo. The jamming device trapped Gregor's fleet, a surprise farewell from Persephone and the ultimate double cross. Over the next 10 days, we raced forward and they tried to flee. He pleaded for parley and then for quarter." He shook his head. "Reaching him required heavy losses. There, we knew it was worth the cost." I patted his shoulder. Taking him down was the right move. "Yes, except it never stopped. Ever since that day. Gregor died a martyr, encouraging millions. Now it's a constant back and forth between the mercenaries and the pirates," Gramps said. "Privateers and relocation asset managers." My jest earned a chuckle. "But yeah, mercenaries and pirates," I said with a smirk. "Well, at least Mars and Centauri teamed up to form the corridor with the MC Navy," Gramps grumbled. He carried a resentment for all the mistakes humans made in the past. I nodded, feeling the bench sliding back. Our time inside the nice viewport ended. Gramps had a point. A few of the old and new nations formed coalitions to combine navies and protect their citizens. Their mandate contained borders, and their admirals weren't heroes who saved small outposts months away. The militaries of humanity tended to their own flocks, and that was it. The rest of humanity that expanded did so at their own risk. Many couldn't afford a ship capable of defeating a pirate, or crew it, and the justifications for hiring a privateer or mercenary crew increased. Those were the fantastic postings that the majority of my class obtained. Hell, even Veronica, my only friend from the 4 months of training, was hired to be a gunner aboard the Ferox. Good for him. Me? No. And it was time to come clean about the why with Gramps. "So, Gramps," I said, pushing his sled into the flow of traffic, "I'm going to an outer system. With the current buoy technology, I can get a message here in a few days. Faster if I pay a heavy fee, but seeing you will be hard." "What? An outer system?" His hands flew up in protest. "That's fallacy. You finished top of your class," he said with a scoff. I swerved around a wall crew, pruning vegetables, and said, "Yup, and that mattered little. Look, Gramps, I love you. Thanks for coming out. No one else would have come or mattered as much to me. I know your fixed budget had to be nonsense. I'm still livid you assumed your father's debts. I'm so sorry, Bruce. If only I had figured it out earlier," Gramps said, covering 2 key issues. I walked us silently, stealing views of space outside the orbital. My father abused me verbally, and at times physically. The scars of failures warped my reality and were something I never forgave or forgot. Marty Castile was a warrior and an alcoholic. Only a few times did he ever enter a sober stretch. One of those times revolved around creating me at a surrogate facility. My mother received a hefty sum of Mars Centauri credits for me. I'll never understand his reasoning for raising me by himself. I'll never be able to kick his ass and pry the truth out of him either. From birth to 8, life was average. From 8 to 14, I received the most brutal military training a young man could receive. My father's occupation: interdiction and boarding training for the MC Navy. When I turned 8, he brought me into work to show me the awesome training machines he used. Being the fool that I was back then, I eagerly joined the simulations and triggered something in my father. If only I could go back in time. From that day on, I became his prized pupil. He brought me in every chance he could as he attempted to mold me into one of his soldiers. When I turned 14, he suddenly died in a training accident during a real-world exercise. The ship he was boarding had a reactor meltdown that caused a big explosion. One day I got yelled at for a missed 0G push-off, and the next, he was gone forever. For a while, I thought it was fake. As time transitioned and my father never returned, I figured it was a cover-up. There was a massive downside to his sudden demise. The MC Coalition didn't forgive debt upon death. Either the financial burden went to me while I assumed the liabilities when I turned 20, or it went to Gramps. Gramps would have had to pay right away and die from the lack of credits to buy his life extenders. The court allowed me to assume the debt, and now, after years of applying to certification courses across the galaxy, the Moon Orbital accepted my application. I happened to be very proficient in 0G or low-gravity combat. I held a high proficiency in most weapons, knew anti-pirate doctrine, and kept my body in shape so I could handle heavy gravity. The issue was never my qualifications for schooling. It was always the overhead debt. The applications always ran a check. My father's substantial debt meant I could turn to being a pirate or was susceptible to bribes. The Mars Centauri Navy didn't even give my application a second look. Their automatic reply was to reapply post-debt, so I was ostracized for being a young man from Mars's orbital attached to Deimos's moon and drowning in debt. Yep, top of my class, and I applied everywhere, I said to Gramps with a heavy heart. And? He asked. I turned right, taking us to a shuttle corridor. The crowds thinned, and I slowed the pace, knowing our time was coming to an end. And my debt is a liability. The Core Galactic Banking Pact really screws someone in my position. Ever heard of the Jebulin system? I asked. Nope, can't say that I have. That bad? He asked. That bad. So it's 93 light-years from Sol. I'll sleep it and then arrive at my posting. The pay actually is decent, but the system is unknown. I'm going to be guarding a planetary outpost in the atmosphere, I said. Gravity? He asked. Unique. The posting is guarding some overweight researcher named Bran Tibulin. Honestly, I'm okay with bunking with a slob for a year to help reduce this debt, I said with a grimace. Thank you, Gramps said, patting my hand over his shoulder. I know we've had this conversation often, but I do appreciate your sacrifice. You died, or I struggled to live. Not a hard choice, I countered. He shook his head. It's a very easy choice for some. I just hope you stay one of the good ones, even though the deck is stacked against you. We're here, I said, seeing a waiting area for shuttles from Moon Orbital to Mars. He would have to connect to Deimos from Mars, and I hoped the trip didn't strain him too much. Sorry I can't help you with the shuttle costs. Think nothing of it, my boy, he said. I'm proud of you. Be patient. Let these idiots think what they want. You're the best, regardless of your origins. Aye, Gramps, I know it. You take care of yourself, I said, and we exchanged a hug. After a few more goodbyes, he checked in. With a final wave, he vanished to load onto a shuttle. I stood there, conflicted. Liam Castile was the finest man I knew, and I doubted I'd ever see him alive again. I honestly was surprised he survived the journey to my graduation. As I contemplated his life, and mine, I knew I'd try my best to make him proud of me. With laden feet, I trudged to my own sealed fate. I walked for the shuttle chain that would take me to the farthest reaches of colonized space.